Welcome to Bookish Brummy. My name's Mel and I like to review books that I've read. So on today's video we're going to review a book that I read in December called The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. Now I did do a mini review of this in one of my reading wrap-ups in December, because I normally do at least one video a week where I'll review all the books that I've read in that week, and normally those reviews don't have spoilers. And then every so often, if I find a book that really sort of catches my attention, I like to do a more in-depth review. And those videos do contain spoilers because I talk about the plot line in detail. So I'm just going to preface this video now with there will be spoilers for this book. So if you haven't read this book and you're thinking that you might want to read it, maybe just go back into my December weekly reviews. It's the last weekly review in December, I think, where I posted about this book, and you'll get an idea of the book without knowing any of the details. However, if you have read this book and you actually want to talk about plotline more in depth, that's what I'm going to be doing today. So this video is more for me talking about the plotline and inconsistencies that I found in the plotline that I wanted to talk about, but I couldn't talk about in the sort of smaller review because I didn't want to give anything away for people that hadn't read it. So essentially this book was published in 1994 and it was shortlisted for the International Booker Prize in 2020. It's an absolutely fantastic book. Now, I'm not holding a copy because I got my copy from the library. However, I did really like this book, so I should imagine that I will purchase it at some point to put on my shelves. Now, I rated it a 4-star in my review video, so even though I'm raving about how good this book is, I didn't give it a 5. And the reason I didn't give it a 5 is, as I said, there was inconsistencies in how the storyline unfolded that were difficult for me to sort of get over, and I think that had there not been as many inconsistencies, then I probably would have been able to overlook a few little things and I would have given it a 5. But that's the reason why it didn't get a 5 and I scored it a 4. However, the way that the book is written is absolutely beautiful. I mean, the prose is beautiful and it just really drew me in. So we'll start with like basically what the story is about. So we're following our main character, which is a young woman who I believe to be in her late 20s, possibly early 30s. She doesn't have a name. Like, I'm sure she does, but we don't know the name. We never learn the name of our main character. And basically it's narrated from her point of view. And she's living on this island by herself because both of her parents have died. And she actually states at the beginning of the book that the nurse who used to live with them to take care of her mother, I think it was, had also passed away 2 years previously. So she's almost completely alone. The only other 2 characters on the island that she really has anything to do with are her editor, because she's a novelist, and her editor goes by the name of R, so we never learn his full name either, he's just known as R. And then there's the old man who used to be friends with her parents, and he's only ever referred to as the old man. We never actually learn his name either. So naming's not like too big in this book, but that's absolutely fine because, to be honest, there's so few characters, it's really easy to keep track of everybody. And as I say, it's been narrated from the woman who's the main character in the story's perspective. Now they live on this island, and this island seems to be ruled by this authoritarian regime who are called the Memory Police. And what they essentially do is ensure that when something is banned from the island, that then people have to forget about it. So it sort of starts off with small things. So they might say, oh, pencils are banned. And the way the character talks about it, she said you get this feeling in the night where something is going to change, like something is different, and then you wake up in the morning and you'll know that something has changed, and they will kind of realise that something is going to go missing, something's been banned. So they wake up and they'll go outside and then they'll try and figure out what it is. And so if pencils have disappeared or are no longer allowed, then they would empty their homes of these items, get rid of them. There might be a communal bonfire for them, and then over time they would lose memory of this object. So they would lose memory of the fact that this object even existed, they would lose memory of the fact of the word that described it, So there's an interesting scene in the book where, because this has been going on since before her parents died, so she's always lived in this regime, and her mother seems to be different from other people. She doesn't seem to forget things once an object has disappeared, but she also tries to preserve objects that are meant to disappear. So she has, they have this basement, and in it she's got this sort of bureau with all these little drawers, and locked in each drawer is a different object, and she'll get them out periodically and give them to her daughter and say, do you know what this is? And her daughter will have never seen these objects before, she won't know the names of them. And so I think there were things like an emerald was in there, a bottle of perfume was in there, and various other things. Now, because these things have like gone from the public consciousness, like the public memory, she would never have heard about them in a story or a book or anything like that. So she only knows about them because her mother has shown them to her, but then she loses memory of them pretty soon after the object has been taken away from her. So interestingly, with the perfume though, she does remember the smell of the perfume, but she can't remember that it's called perfume, and she can't really describe it very well later on. Now, because they're living in an authoritarian regime, if people by chance happen to remember things, that's a problem, and the memory police actually take those people away, and nobody entirely knows like what happens to those people, but it seems like that they are assassinated somehow by the regime. So our character's mother gets called up to go to the headquarters of the memory police, and this is before it's well known that the memory police will basically assassinate people who are against the regime because they have this biological difference, which means that they can remember these objects after they've been banned. And so she gets called to headquarters, and then a week later her body gets sent back, and they claim that she had a heart attack or a stroke. I think it was a stroke that she had, and that had killed her, which nobody really believes. So you have people who don't sort of like the fact that things keep disappearing, so some people sort of want to fight against that, but I've got to be honest, like there's not much resistance against this regime throughout the book. Most of the citizens of this island are really passive of this regime, and when they try to talk to each other about it, people are quite hesitant to discuss it as well. And I think that that actually was the case in authoritarian regimes, because obviously you don't really know who is secretly working for the regime, so obviously I guess neighbours weren't really wanting to discuss how they felt about things disappearing. But our main character, she does try to discuss it with the old man, and she'll, you know, ask him things like, aren't you worried about if everything disappears, like what becomes of us and things like that. So they have an awareness that things disappear, but they just can't necessarily remember the things that disappear. Now, here is where I start to get a bit confused with that, because if our characters can't remember the objects, I don't know how they would remember that things had disappeared. And I'm also a bit confused about how the memory police actually control this, because in some respects, like there's a scene where the birds disappear, birds are no longer allowed. So this isn't something that people can get out of their houses and burn. These are like live, you know, animals that are outside, and then all the birds get up and fly off and nobody knows where they've gone. And I suppose my question would be that because the memory police have decided that the island can no longer have birds, who told the birds that they had to leave? You know, like how are the memory police actually controlling this? Because they can't see directly into people's brains as far as we're aware, because the people that do manage to remember these, because they're a biological anomaly, they are like stealthily tracked down by the memory police through things that they say or do which indicate actually know that they haven't forgotten about something. So I'm thinking, well, when it comes to something that's like a third party, let's say, that's not another human being that the memory police can say, oh, you need to get that out of your house, I don't really know how we make like birds disappear. And then how it is that people, like this mechanism that people actually forget these items ever existed in the first place. because our main character remembers her parents and her parents have died. So her parents are not currently there, they haven't been there for several years, but she hasn't forgotten them. The absence of their presence has not made her forget them or have a memory of them. You know, whereas things like birds and you know, like pencils, they've suddenly gone from her brain because the memory police have dictated it somehow. So it's this mechanism that I can't really get an understanding of, to understand like actually how people are forgetting this, because the memory police are not giving them any medication or any pills to make them forget. They're just policing the fact that they do forget, from what I can tell, and they're also dictating what it is that has to go missing. So in the instance when the birds disappeared, you know, I don't know who told the birds they had to fly off or how the birds knew that they had to fly off, like what caused that, we've no idea. But the memory police did come to our character's house to clear it out because her father had been an ornithologist, so he had a lot of books on birds. So obviously they had to be destroyed. So I can understand them coming in and physically overseeing the clearance of that. I just don't know how they got the birds to fly off. And then, as I've mentioned, our character is a novelist. So she's written 3 novels at the start of the book, and throughout the book she's writing her 4th novel. And so in some chapters we actually get to read, you know, parts of this novel. And it's, you know, it's very complementary, I think, to the story. So the character in the novel that she's writing loses her sort of sense of self and then eventually loses her voice. Whereas I would say it's the reverse in this novel, because our character loses her voice and then she loses her sense of self. So what's interesting is that novels get banned, which is obviously a big problem for our character. Not that she sees it as a problem, but she's like, oh, what am I going to do now? And that sort of brings up the discussion of what happens when professions disappear. What have the other islanders done? And apparently the other islanders just retrain and like forget, I guess, about that profession. But I was confused on 2 fronts with this, because the old man who she spends a lot of time with used to be the ferry captain, or he used to work on the main ferry that used to go from their island to the mainland, and then the ferry got banned, so he obviously had to retrain, like doing whatever he was doing. But even though the ferry or boats have been banned, they always still seem to remember the word for ferry, and he always remembers that he worked on the ferry. She remembers that he worked on the ferry, and that was how he'd somehow been friends with her parents. So in this instance, they both seem to have a memory of this profession. So that confuses me, that we know that he worked on a ferry and that she remembers that and he remembers that, and from time to time like they talk about it. So that's a bit confusing, because that doesn't really fit with the main storyline of they should forget about it. And you know, neither of these 2 characters are proven to be, you know, in the subset of people that are biologically different, where they can continue to remember even after the item or thing has been banned and disappeared. But also, with her being a novelist, when they ban books, is quite a horrifying scene, really. So everybody, you know, goes outside and they all make a pile of their books, and then they'll start having a book burning. And they have a library on the island, and that library is set fire to by the memory police, so they're, you know, they're burning it up. And then I'm just going to refer to my notes here so I can see exactly like what they said. But yeah, on like the one page, on page 183, it says the library was completely engulfed in flames. And then on page 184 it says, but there's nothing to be done. It's not as though they're burning every printed word, it's just the novels, so there's no reason to think they'll go any further anytime soon. So we're saying we're banning novels, which is a particular type of book. So we're not saying that we're banning novellas, and we're not saying that we're banning we're not saying we're banning non-fiction or encyclopedias or dictionaries or anything like that. So it's purely the idea of the novel that they're banning. Yet the memory police have set fire to the entire library, and my assumption is that in the library you would have all kinds of books in there. So again, that's a little bit confusing because it's like, are we talking about banning books, or are we talking about banning a specific type of book? And the line on 183, which, you know, the one character is saying, no, 184, sorry, where the one character is saying, well, then they're not burning the whole printed word, they're just banning novels, would indicate to me that they are banning that specific type of book. So therefore I don't understand why everyone in public is getting every single book off their shelf to burn, because, you know, I would guess a lot of people probably have like reference books, non-fiction books, you know, autobiographies and things like that. So again, that was a little bit confusing. Then, you know, the story starts to get a little bit horrifying then, when actually the items that start to disappear that are not allowed goes off, like, you know, tangible items that you can hold, like books, pens and things like that, and actually starts going into body parts. So our character wakes up, and I think it's her left leg, and she realises that something's wrong. You know, she gets that feeling in the night, something's going to disappear, and then it's her left leg. But the left leg isn't really disappeared because it's still attached to her body, but she no longer has sensation in it. She doesn't know what to do with it. She doesn't know how to walk with it. And she goes outside, and everybody else, you know, is having the same problem. And then they talk about, well, what will the memory police do about this? Like, will we be expected to amputate a limb? Now, I think if the book had gone down this path, this would have been very, very dark, and this would have almost made it the perfect horror novel, I think. But the book doesn't go there, actually. Like, the memory police don't make anybody amputate anything. So all these people are now, you know, dragging a left leg around. They can't really remember what it's called. But this is where I get confused, because their right leg doesn't disappear, and left leg and right leg basically share the same name, leg. It's just left or right. But then later on, I think it's their right arm they lose, but they get to keep their left arm. So again, now you would say, well, they're both called arm, but to refer to your right arm, you'd have to say right and left, right? So I suppose what I'm saying is, we haven't banned the words left and right, and we can't ban the word arm or leg because it still exists on the other side of the body. So this is where, again, I get a little bit confused that the characters don't really understand what it is that's attached to their body and like what they're meant to do with it. I don't understand how the memory police can possibly control the body parts that are attached to people. So it doesn't go any further than that, in the sense of we don't get to a point where literally you know, people then don't have a heart and things like that. It doesn't happen like that. But our main character, she is living, well, she's taken into hiding her editor, because her editor is like her mother, and he has this biological difference where actually he doesn't forget. So these kind of people are much easier to be caught out by the memory police, because obviously if they are not dragging their left leg around and know what to do with their right arm and things like that, it's pretty obvious that they still remember, and so therefore they are not as affected. Whereas when it was small objects like jewels, or, you know, garden implements or household items, nobody would really know if somebody had a memory of that or not, unless they suddenly blurted the word out in a conversation. So he's living under her floorboards, and, you know, we sort of get, you know, a bit of a idea of like Anne Frank about this, like he's trying to hide out through this regime and wait for it to be over so that he can be reunited with his wife and his newborn child, who he's never met. But he's hiding under her floorboards because she's decided, you know, she wants to help him. But as things go on, and she loses the ability to move certain body parts, and she starts to lose, you know, her like she loses her voice, and she loses her mind, essentially. He has to start caring for her because she can't actually get down into the basement to look after him. Like, she's like not able to from a physical perspective once she starts losing you know, the use of her body parts. And then obviously when she loses her mind and her voice, she kind of needs looking after, and he does that and performs that for her. So we never actually at the end of this book find out if this regime continues to the point where everybody on the island dies other than the people who are biologically immune to what's going on. And then, you know, would they get found out? Would they be able to walk out into public? We don't know. I think it's also worth noting that the memory police themselves don't seem to lose memory of things, because like when the incident with the left leg was happening, she actually, like our main character, sort of observed that the memory police were walking around like absolutely fine, like, you know, so she was thinking, well, if they're allowed to have their left leg and they seem to know what to do with it, then maybe they can't make us amputate our legs and things like that. So I'd say in this book there's definitely there's magical realism going on here. You really have to suspend your disbelief, I think, in some parts with this book, because if you try to make it make sense like I have just done, it just doesn't make sense. There are like too many parts that don't add up. But I also think with this book that it's not really about the memory police. So even though the book is called The Memory Police and they are the authoritative regime, I don't think it's about them, and I think that's why we don't really learn about the mechanism, about how they're going about stuff, and we don't really have any main characters who are from the memory police, and we don't really understand, other than the fact that they're saying no, it has to go away, we don't really understand anything about them. I think what this book is, and I'd said in my smaller review, this is an allegory for dementia or people who suffer brain injuries, because it seems like when you really look at it, like for example, when our main character towards the end of the book was really having to be looked after by the character R, who was the editor, I would say that when she died, then he was released in a way, because he was being held, not hostage, but he was being held hostage by the regime, if you like. But he'd had to go into hiding in her house and nobody could know about him, and he could never leave, and he couldn't go to his wife, and he couldn't have a social life, he couldn't just go out whenever he wanted. He was totally dependent on her and what she was doing, and then he, you know, he's having to like attend to her every need. And then obviously when she has passed away, he's like suddenly freed from that. And I think that, as I say, I think that that is somehow, he's like a symbol of Alzheimer's, because he is imprisoned by the fact that she is biologically receptive to the fact that she's forgetting everything, you know. So I think that not only is this book looking at our main character who is forgetting everything, it's also using the editor character R, who is you know, in hiding in her house, is also looking at, you know, the families of people who actually have to care for people who basically lose their memory of things. So this is why I think that this book is so beautifully written in that way, because it's not just focusing on one side of it. You can actually see, you know, the counter side to it, of the people who are trying to cope in a world where the people around them have totally forgotten everything, you know. And it's not like these people forget everything all at once, like everything is sort of going away slowly, randomly. There's no rhyme or reason to why things suddenly disappear. So, you know, one day it could be birds, the next day it could be egg cups, the next day after that it could be a spoon, and then the day after that it's a novel, and then the day after that, look, you know, it's a leg. You know, there's no natural pattern that they could follow to say, well, this is, you know, the order that things would disappear in. And again, I think that that very much does mimic you know, the condition of dementia, when people who have suddenly, or people who've just had a brain injury and maybe have I think it's called aphasia, where they can forget random items. It's just suddenly like there's a hole in their memory and they don't know what the item is for, or they don't know what to do with it. You know, it's like they've never heard of it before, or they can't recognise it in a picture, you know, and they can't write the word down, like it's just absolutely meaningless to them. And that's what this book is making you see, you know. And as you're going through, you're like, oh, this is like a bit nuts. And I think if you try to look at the book like I have done and try to apply a reason, well, why is this happening, why is this happening, why is this happening, you actually can't. But again, the book might be written in this way because it's trying to resemble, you know, the fact that there is no pattern in dementia or loss of memory when people forget things who are in this position. So yeah, like there is no reason, so why would the book have reason? And you know, maybe the memory police aren't really, you know, maybe they're not. I know sometimes with dementia sufferers or Alzheimer's sufferers, especially because I had an Alzheimer's sufferer in my family, they can begin to believe that there's outside forces affecting their thinking pattern. So the person that I knew who had Alzheimer's believed that there were little men at the end of their driveway who were like plotting things against them. You know, so in a way we could say that the memory police potentially to our character is their version of that, but they're just calling them the memory police, but actually it's actually their own head, because there's nobody actually coming physically, you know, chopping a leg off or taking a spoon off her or taking the books out of her house or anything like that. So it leads you to think, like, actually, well, how much of this is maybe going on in our main character's head, and then obviously the other two characters that are there are sort of representative of, you know, people who are trying to care for people in this condition, which is why, you know, we're not necessarily seeing the story from their point of view, but we're just seeing it from our main character's view of them, because she does rely on both of those characters quite a lot as well in her life to get her through her day to day. Like at the start of the book, she's very capable, and you know, is able to look after herself and do all these things, and then as the book goes on she becomes more and more dependent on these two characters, which again, if you are losing your mind, you do become more dependent on the people around you. So yeah, I just really wanted to talk about this book and wanted to talk about these inconsistencies and actually what those inconsistencies might mean to the plot line. I mean, I obviously don't know for sure, so it'd be really interesting if any of you have actually read this book, like what your view on that. Did you find there was inconsistencies that bothered you while you were reading it? Were you able to rationalise any inconsistencies that you found? Because I think whilst I have found inconsistency, I've managed to rationalise the inconsistency as to why it's there. You know, and I think I've had about 3 weeks sort of after having read this book to sort of think about this. And when I originally scored it a 4-star, I have not managed to rationalise the inconsistencies at that point. They were just so many of them, and I thought, okay, I really like the way this book is written and I really like what the author's sort of trying to do, and I would definitely read it again, but there's too many inconsistencies to score it a 5. But I think now I've had time to sit on it and think about it and actually think, actually, I think there's a reason for those inconsistencies. Actually works quite well with the story that's being told. I think I would actually raise my rating on this book now probably to 4.5, because I think that they're there for a reason. So yeah, let me know what you think of this book yourself if you have read it, and let me know as well if you've read any books that are similar to this one, because I thought the subject matter was really interesting, and having been personally affected by Alzheimer's and dementia in my family, I'm quite keen actually to read books that might help me understand a little bit what the person who's going through that is actually going through. So if you like this video, please press the like button, and if you'd like to see any of my future videos and want to know when they're coming out, please press the subscribe button. My next video will be on Thursday, where I do a weekly review of all the books that I've read in the last week. Those reviews don't have spoilers, and they don't go into as much detail as the one that we've spoken about today, but hopefully you'll come along and I'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching. Bye!